I used a breakup as a threat to win arguments. So he changed the locks. I am 28. I lived rent-free in my boyfriend's luxury apartment for a year. Whenever he asked me to do basic chores or contribute, I would casually threaten to break up with him, fully knowing he would panic and apologize. I used our entire relationship as a hostage negotiation to get my way. But one night, I dropped the nuclear option over a messy kitchen, and he finally stopped bending. He calmly agreed, changed the locks the very next morning, and permanently evicted me from the luxurious life I arrogantly took for granted. Here is my side of the story. My name is Shirley Laurie. I am 28 years old, and I technically work as a freelance social media consultant. I desperately want to tell you about the exact, humiliating moment I accidentally evicted myself from my own luxurious life. It absolutely wasn't a massive, cinematic betrayal. I didn't cheat on him. I didn't steal money from his bank account. It was just a single, lazy, arrogant sentence. A sentence I carelessly threw out across a messy kitchen, entirely because I didn't want to spend 10 minutes loading a dishwasher. I looked at my boyfriend, and I casually threatened to break up with him. I said those words fully, arrogantly expecting him to panic. I mathematically expected him to back down, apologize for annoying me, and quietly clean the kitchen himself. Because that is exactly what he had done a dozen times before. Instead, he looked right through me. His eyes went completely, terrifyingly blank. He simply said, "Okay." And while I slept peacefully that night, completely convinced I had won the argument and put him back in his place, he calmly packed my bags. He scheduled a locksmith. And he permanently, surgically deleted me from his entire existence. I played a toxic, manipulative game with a man's boundaries. And I won the ultimate, devastating prize. I was dating a man named Vincent Crawford. Vincent is 31 years old, and he is a brilliant, highly paid senior software engineer. We had been together for a little over 2 years. For the last 12 months of that relationship, we had been living together in his pristine, luxury apartment downtown. I urgently need to be completely, brutally honest about the financial reality of that apartment. And the financial reality of our entire relationship. Vincent paid for absolutely everything. He paid the massive $3,000 monthly rent completely on his own. He paid the electric bill. He paid the water bill. He paid for the high-speed fiber internet that I desperately needed to upload my freelance content to my clients. He bought the expensive, organic groceries every single Sunday. He paid for the streaming accounts. He paid for the dinners out. Before I moved in with Vincent, I was living with 3 incredibly messy roommates in a terrible, loud part of the city. I was constantly stressed about money. Constantly checking my bank account to see if I could afford coffee. My freelance income was, and still is, incredibly sporadic. Some months I made a few $100s. Most months, I made absolutely nothing at all. Vincent rescued me from that chaotic life. He absorbed the entire, massive financial load of 2 adults, without ever explicitly complaining. He didn't make me sign a contract. He didn't ask for a spreadsheet of my expenses. He was a natural provider. He was a deeply, fundamentally good man. And I completely, systematically took advantage of his generosity. Because I didn't have to desperately worry about making rent anymore, I got incredibly comfortable. And then, over a few short months, that comfortable relief violently metastasized into pure, unadulterated entitlement. I started treating his beautiful apartment like my own personal luxury hotel. I started sleeping in until noon while he was on endless conference calls. I would leave my clothes draped all over his expensive, minimalist furniture. I would leave my makeup scattered across the dual vanity in the master bathroom. And slowly, subconsciously, I started treating Vincent like he was the hotel concierge. Someone whose sole purpose in life was to facilitate my comfort. Over the course of a year, I discovered a terrifyingly effective cheat code to win absolutely any argument we had. Vincent was a peaceful man. He absolutely hated toxic conflict. He wanted his home to be a quiet sanctuary after his brutal 12-hour coding shifts at the tech firm. He wanted harmony above all else. So, whenever he gently asked me to help around the house, whenever he delicately brought up the massive imbalance in our daily responsibilities, I would simply drop the nuclear option. I remember the very first time I did it. We were arguing because I wanted him to buy me a $2,000 Louis Vuitton bag for my birthday. He had gently suggested that maybe we should save the money for a trip instead. I felt a flash of immense annoyance. I didn't want a trip. I wanted the Louis Vuitton bag. So, I looked at him, sighed dramatically, and said, "Well, if we have such different financial values, maybe we should just break up." It was an impulsive, defensive reaction. A bluff. But I watched the color completely drain from his face. I watched the pure panic set into his eyes. I watched him immediately back down. He apologized for pressuring me. He instantly dropped the subject. And 3 days later, the Louis Vuitton bag was sitting on the kitchen island. It was an absolute, intoxicating rush of power. I realized, in that exact moment, that as long as I held the entire relationship hostage, I could get away with absolutely anything. If I threatened to leave, he would immediately fold. I used that manipulative, toxic threat a dozen times over the next year. It became my ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. If he asked me to vacuum, I threatened the relationship. If he asked me to contribute to the grocery bill, I threatened the relationship. I never, ever actually intended to leave him. I would have been homeless and broke in a week. I just desperately wanted to avoid any human accountability. I wanted to be completely taken care of, without having to offer anything in return except my physical presence. The final, fatal incident happened on a Thursday night in late October. I had been lounging in the apartment since 2 in the afternoon. I hadn't done a single productive thing all day. I hadn't answered a single client email. The kitchen sink was violently overflowing with my dirty coffee cups and sticky plates from the last 3 days. I had left empty, smelly takeout boxes scattered across his pristine quartz counters. Vincent walked through the front door at exactly 7 o'clock. He looked absolutely exhausted. His shoulders were slumped. He rubbed his temples like he had a visible, throbbing headache. I didn't get up to greet him. I didn't even say hello. I just kept scrolling loudly through TikTok on the sofa, letting the audio bleed into the room. He walked into the kitchen, saw the massive, disgusting mess, and I heard him take a deep, heavy breath. He didn't yell. He kept his voice perfectly neutral. "Hey," he said quietly. "Did you happen to clean up the kitchen today?" I sighed aggressively. Like he was actively ruining my peaceful evening just by existing in his own home. "No," I said, without bothering to look up from my bright screen. "I was busy, and I didn't feel like it." He paused. Then he asked, very politely, if I could maybe help him clean it up now, before we figured out what to order for dinner. I felt that familiar, toxic flash of extreme annoyance. How dare he ask me to do chores when I was clearly relaxing? He had the money. If he wanted a clean kitchen, he could hire a cleaning service. I didn't even think about it. I didn't weigh the consequences. I just reached right for my absolute favorite weapon. I snapped my head up. I glared at him with pure disgust. And I dropped the bomb. I am not your maid, Vincent. If you don't like how I do things, we can just break up. I leaned back against the cushions. I waited for the usual script to play out. I waited for the panic in his eyes. I waited for the desperate apology. I waited for him to quietly turn around and start running the hot water in the sink himself. Instead, there was absolute, terrifying silence. I looked over at him standing by the island. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He was looking at me with a terrifying, ice-cold clarity. It was like a heavy steel door had just slammed shut behind his eyes. He didn't yell. He simply said, "Okay." My eyebrows went up. I was genuinely confused. The script was broken. "Okay, what?" "Okay," he repeated. His voice was completely dead. Entirely hollow. "If that's what you want, we're done." I actually smirked at him. I arrogantly thought he was just being passive-aggressive. I thought he was throwing a tiny, harmless tantrum. I assumed he was just tired from work, and that his little rebellion would completely reset by morning. "Good," I said dismissively. Then stopped complaining. I turned my attention right back to my phone. I felt entirely victorious. I had won the standoff again. I didn't have to clean the kitchen. To forcefully prove absolutely how unbothered I was, I opened a delivery app. I used his linked credit card to order myself expensive, spicy Thai food. The exact kind I knew he absolutely hated and couldn't eat because of his reflux. When the food arrived, I ate it on the couch. I turned the TV volume up. I completely ignored him. I didn't offer him a single bite. I watched him make a cold turkey sandwich and eat it standing entirely alone at the counter. I actually looked over at him, wiped my mouth, and smugly said, "See? Problem solved." I was so incredibly drunk on my own perceived leverage. I went to bed that night feeling like an absolute queen who had just successfully trained her subject. I mumbled "love you" in the dark, fully expecting things to be magically normal tomorrow. I had absolutely no idea that while I was sleeping, Vincent was sitting in the dark living room, systematically dismantling my entire life. I woke up the next morning to bright sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I hummed a song in the shower. I did my extensive, 45-minute skincare routine. I walked into the living room wrapped in a towel, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Vincent was sitting perfectly still on the couch. He was already fully dressed in jeans and a sweater. He was just watching me. "You okay?" I asked. I was suddenly deeply suspicious of his rigid posture. "Yeah," he said smoothly. "Just up early." I shrugged it off. I was entirely too arrogant to read the temperature of the room. I brewed his expensive coffee. I set up my massive makeup mirror on his dining table. I complained to him about my friends. I asked him to help me find my black heels. I casually mentioned I had a networking brunch, and that I might be out late that night. "Don't wait up," I warned him. At 9:12, I grabbed my expensive purse and my oversized Versace sunglasses. I leaned in and gave him an automatic, lifeless kiss on the cheek. "Don't be grumpy later," I scolded him, treating the man who funded my entire existence like a petulant child. "You know how you get." He didn't say a single word in response. He just watched me walk out his front door with absolutely dead eyes. I spent the entire day at my networking brunch, drinking bottomless mimosas. I complained endlessly to my girlfriends about how needy and controlling Vincent was becoming about the apartment. I was actively playing the victim. I painted him as a neat freak tyrant. I fully expected to go home later to a sparkling clean kitchen, a freshly vacuumed rug, and an apologetic boyfriend begging for my affection. I arrived back at the luxury apartment complex at exactly 6:47 that evening. I rode the elevator up. I walked down the familiar, carpeted hallway. I slid my brass key into the deadbolt. It didn't turn. I jiggled it. I pulled it out and aggressively pushed it back in. It hit a hard, metallic wall. It was a completely different lock. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable stutter in my chest. I pulled out my phone. My battery was at 12%. I was entirely more annoyed than panicked at this point. Hey, I'm outside. Why isn't my key working? I waited. The text delivered. It flashed red. No response. 5 minutes passed. The hallway was completely silent. My annoyance instantly metastasized into blind, hot rage. I started calling him. The phone rang, and then went straight to voicemail. I started frantically typing. What the hell is this? Vincent, answer me right now. Stop being so dramatic. I called again. Voicemail. At 7:03, I lost my temper completely. I balled my fist and I pounded on the heavy wooden door. It was the arrogant, entitled knock of a woman who fully believed she owned the space on the other side. Vincent! I screamed through the wood. Open this door right now. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down, fully expecting a desperate apology and an excuse about a broken lock. It was a single text message from him. You said we could break up. All the air violently left my lungs. The floor felt like it was tilting. The bottom completely dropped out of my stomach. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a tantrum. I started pounding on the door again, entirely frantic now. Are you seriously doing this over dinner? I shrieked. I heard his footsteps slowly approaching from the inside. He didn't touch the lock. No, Vincent's voice came through the heavy wood. It was incredibly calm. Incredibly cold. I am doing this over absolute disrespect. I felt a wave of absolute, primal terror wash over me. I instantly flipped the switch. I dropped the rage completely. I went straight to begging. Vincent, come on, I pleaded, my voice shaking uncontrollably. I didn't mean it like that. You know exactly how I talk when I'm annoyed. That is the exact problem, Shirley, he said through the door. You say terrible things you don't mean, because you never expect to face actual consequences. I panicked. I desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. So what? You just decided this entirely on your own? Yes, he said perfectly smoothly. Just like you did. The hallway felt like it was physically shrinking around me. You're actually breaking up with me, I whispered in absolute shock. I already did, he replied. And then, I heard his footsteps slowly, methodically walk away from the door. I didn't knock again. I stood there in the hallway for 20 minutes. I couldn't breathe. My phone battery ticked down to 9%. I realized, standing in that freezing corridor, that absolutely everything I owned was gone. My expensive clothes, my makeup, my warm bed, my entire life was locked behind a piece of wood I no longer had legal access to. I had to humiliatingly call my friend Rachel from the hallway floor. I had to beg her to let me sleep on her cramped, smelly couch. She sounded incredibly annoyed when she agreed. Over the next 48 hours, I completely unraveled. I realized the horrifying extent of my own financial illiteracy. I had absolutely no money saved. I had nowhere to live. I was completely dependent on a man I had treated like absolute garbage. I sent him dozens of frantic texts. First I was angry. I told him everyone thought he was acting insane. Then I was bargaining. I was joking, right? You know I was joking. By the second night at Rachel's, listening to her roommate scream at a video game in the next room, I was completely broken. At 2 in the morning, I sent the most pathetic, desperate text of my entire life. Please. I'm sorry. I'll make dinner. I'll do better. Just let me come home. He read it. He did absolutely not respond. On the third day, I went back to the luxury apartment building. I managed to slip in behind a resident. I went up to his floor. I looked through the peephole. I knocked so softly. I wore his old, faded hoodie that I happened to have in my gym bag. I stripped off all my makeup. I desperately wanted to look small. I wanted him to pity me. Vincent, I whispered through the door. Can we please talk? I know I messed up. I didn't think you'd take it seriously. That's the problem, he said from the other side. I did. I'll change, I pleaded, crying actual, hyperventilating tears. I swear to God I won't say stuff like that anymore. I'm not interested in promises, he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was just utterly exhausted. I'm interested in peace. So that's it, I choked out. Yes. I stood there for a full minute, waiting for the heavy deadbolt to click. Waiting for the universe to reset. Waiting for my cheat code to work one last time. It never did. I walked away from that door, knowing I had just permanently evicted myself from my own life. I eventually got my bags back a week later. He had packed everything perfectly. Nothing was maliciously damaged. My Versace dresses were folded with incredible precision. Seeing that careful packing actually hurt more than if he had thrown my things in the trash. It proved that he wasn't acting out of rage. He was acting out of absolute, clinical detachment. He had even formally transferred all the streaming accounts back to my email, completely severing us digitally. It was a flawless, surgical amputation. I live with 3 messy roommates now in a tiny, loud apartment. I have to frantically hustle for terrible freelance gigs just to pay my own rent. I have to buy my own cheap groceries. And every single night, when I look at the massive pile of dirty dishes my roommates leave rotting in the sink, I think about the beautiful, pristine quartz counters in Vincent's kitchen. I think about the good man who paid for absolutely everything, and asked for almost nothing in return. I thought Vincent was weak because he always backed down to keep the peace. I arrogantly thought my constant threats were a sign of my own immense power. I was so incredibly wrong. People who casually threaten to leave a relationship never, ever actually expect to be taken seriously. We expect fear. We expect blind compliance. We expect the other person to frantically scramble to prove they are worth staying for. When Vincent simply said okay, he didn't scream. He didn't argue. He just calmly accepted my toxic terms. He showed me that the most terrifying consequence of holding a relationship hostage is when the other person finally decides to just let the hostage die. I aggressively asked for a breakup because I thought it made me powerful. He gave it to me. And now, I am completely powerless. That was Shirley's side, a woman who arrogantly mistook a man's patience for weakness, and learned the hard way that boundaries without consequences are just suggestions. Shirley lived rent-free in Vincent's apartment, fully supported by his income. To avoid any household responsibilities, she weaponized the relationship, casually threatening to break up with him whenever she was mildly inconvenienced. She thought she held all the leverage. But when she dropped the nuclear option one final time over a messy kitchen, Vincent called her bluff. He calmly agreed, changed the locks the next morning, and left her stranded in the hallway. Shirley thought she was playing a game she couldn't lose, only to realize that threatening to leave a man who provides everything is the fastest possible way to ruin your own life. What do you think? Did Shirley get exactly the harsh reality check she deserved, or was Vincent's immediate lockout too cold and calculated? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Silent Speaks for more stories about loud arrogance meeting quiet consequences. New stories every day. #weaponized threat.